Hi everyone, this is Dylan Golby and welcome back to another Gear Short. In my previous video, I gave you my thoughts on Fujifilm's new XF 18mm f1.4, and if you haven't seen that video already, that's a good place to start before jumping into this one. Now, a few of you asked in the comments, could you do a comparison between this and the older lens? So I headed down to our local Fujifilm office and I've been able to borrow the f2 lens, the older lens, for a few days just to make a bit of a comparison. So that's what we're going to do here today. Now, in the interest of keeping this short, let's jump straight in. So the first and most obvious thing that you'll notice about these lenses is just how much bigger the new lens is. The old one is tiny and pocketable, the new one is getting a bit more into the territory of a larger lens. And so there are a few positives and negatives about the smaller size, and there are a lot of reasons why this lens is actually significantly bigger than the other one, and we'll get into those as we start looking at image quality. So as I said, probably the best thing about the size of this lens is that it actually is pocketable, and even with a body attached, if you've got a larger jacket pocket, you can get something like an X-T4 into your pocket with this attached. So it makes it a really, really portable system if you're just going out to do some, casual street photography, or maybe you're going out with friends or something and want to take a camera with you. So that's something that is really good about this lens. However, that small size can actually be a little bit of an issue as well. Now, I found that when my hands were a little bit sweaty, I had a little bit of difficulty mounting it or taking it off the camera, and that is basically because you have essentially focus ring, aperture ring, and mount. The lens is so tiny that there's not really any way to grip onto it. It's a small thing, and if you're careful, you shouldn't have any issues, but I found it to be a little bit annoying at times. In terms of build quality, what you get for the extra money with the f1.4 lens is a lens that just feels a little bit better constructed. It feels a little bit more solid. Everything on the f2 lens just feels a little bit more loose and maybe a little bit cheaper, but it's not a huge difference, and this is still definitely a quality lens. Now this is the first reason for the f1.4 lens being a little bit bigger. It makes use of Fujifilm's new linear motors, which are fast and silent and give really, really confident autofocus. It also makes use of an internal focusing design, which the older lens did not have. So when you actually focus with the older lens, you'll find that the front of the lens actually telescopes in and out in order to focus. And it also uses these DC coreless motors, which are a little bit slower, a little bit less confident, and a little bit more noisy for those who worry about that. But how does it compare in practical use? Well, to be honest, there is no comparison. The f1.4 lens is fast, quiet, and confident, especially when it comes to, lower light or maybe lower contrast light, and also for AFC tracking. There just is really no comparison with this. When you start using the 18mm f2, the telltale signs of those DC coreless motors start to come out. You get a little bit of a wobble at certain times before it actually locks focus. AFC tends to hunt quite a bit and miss quite a few frames, whereas with the f1.4 lens, it just locks on, holds, and tracks, which is a huge, huge difference if you're going to be tracking moving subjects. Now, even with AFS, so single point focus, you'll find that the f1.4 lens, no matter the light, just locks in and goes straight to focus, whereas with this one, you will see a few of those little wobbles that we expect from the DC coreless motors. So here's a quick clip of the two lenses focusing in bright but low contrast light. In order to test the efficacy of the AFC with these two lenses, I put them both onto the X-T4 and had my wife walk towards the camera at a very slow pace, and then once again at a very quick pace. Now, with this, I had the face detection turned on, and it was very easily able to find her face with both lenses. And when she was walking slowly, I was able to get a really good hit rate with both lenses. Now, the f1.4 lens didn't miss a single frame, even when she got really, really close to its minimum focus distance, whereas the f2 lens did really, really well until she got to about the half body mark. And so she's quite close to the camera at that point, and at that point it started to miss maybe 1 in every 3 or so frames. When I asked her to walk a little bit quicker, however, the story was really, really different. Now, again, the f1.4 lens did really, really well. When she got a little bit closer than that half body mark, it did miss 1 in, I think, 6 or 7 frames. And at that point, the cons of the DC coreless motor really start to show themselves in the f2 lens, as it dropped down to about 50% in focus at that point. Back when I started with Fujifilm, I actually started with the X-T1 and the 18mm f2 as a bit of a fun walk-around combination. Now, I quickly sold that lens on as I don't remember it being a very optically impressive lens, and also back then with the autofocus on the X-T1, it was a very, very slow lens, and so I just didn't find it all that useful. Now, I've done a few tests comparing it to the new f1.4 lens, and honestly that wasn't a failure of memory. It's optically not very good, so let's take a look at a few sharpness tests to give you an idea of the detail rendering between the two lenses. When it comes to the f2 lens, even the center isn't great wide open. The f1.4 lens, however, does a really good job wide open, and we've got plenty of detail. Now, with the f2 lens, until you stop down to about f4 or f5.6, you don't really even get close to that sharpness that comes from the f1.4 lens when you use that lens wide open. So in terms of sharpness, there really is no comparison here. The f1.4 lens is the only way to go if you want to get plenty of detail in your images. The f2 lens just really doesn't hold up to it. Also, when you go into the corners of the images, the story gets even worse. Whereas the f1.4 lens is quite good in the corners, and once you stop down to f2 or 2.8, you've got plenty of detail in the corners. However, the f2 lens really only gets acceptable at around about the f8 mark. Color fringing is another area where the newer lens absolutely destroys the older lens. Looking here, you can see that even wide open, the f1.4 lens does a very good job of controlling color fringing. However, the f2 lens doesn't really lose this sort of reddish fringing until around f4 or 5.6 again. Again, when it comes to chroma, the f2 lens shows massive aberrations when you start trying to render pin lights. This makes it tough to recommend for, nighttime cityscapes like this one, or maybe astrophotography. The f1.4 lens, however, shows almost no chroma, making it a great lens for those types of photography. Finally, the f2 lens actually requires a lot on some software trickery to correct for a lot of the aberrations that you'll find due to a basic lack of glass inside the lens. And that's one of the reasons that the f1.4 lens is so big, is it does have a lot of glass in here to start correcting for certain aberrations. So let's take a look at an example of that to show you what I mean. When you first open images from these two lenses side by side, what you'll notice is that the f2 lens actually seems to have a tighter field of view. It feels like it might be more like 19 or 20 millimeters rather than an 18 millimeter lens. And the reason for this actually is that the software corrections have been turned on. Now the f2 lens, due to its simple optical formula, actually has quite bad barrel distortion, and Fujifilm rely on a little bit of software in camera or your post-processing software on the computer when you get the files home to actually correct for that barrel distortion. Now, the f1.4 lens doesn't do this, it's all done with glass inside the lens. And for most people, you're never even going to notice this as it's typically automatically applied. However, if you want to get the full field of view of the lens, the full 18 millimeters, you are going to need to turn that off, and you're going to start seeing the bowing around the edges of the images. When it comes to flare and ghosting, as you guys might know from my Laowa 33mm review, I'm actually of the camp that likes to make use of, interesting flare and ghost. When it's not too obnoxious, it can actually show off the unique characteristics of a lens and make for some interesting images. When it comes to the f2 lens, there's actually one thing that it can do that its better corrected Big Brother can't do, and that is flare quite significantly. So if you actually put the sun or another bright light source just outside of the frame, what you start noticing is a huge flare occurring in the side of the image, and it doesn't matter how far you stop down, it never really goes away. And so you're actually able to make some pretty interesting images with this that you wouldn't be able to make with the f1.4 lens. The other difference that we see here is that the new f1.4 lens produces really big, sharp, beautiful sun stars from pinlight sources. Now, the f2 lens, while it does produce them, they're a little bit softer and a little bit less defined. So that's a thing that's up to personal taste as to which lens you'll prefer there. So as you can hopefully see from this, in every technical metric and pretty much every use case, the f1.4 lens is going to be a significantly superior lens, and that's pretty much why it finds its way into my bag as part of my professional kit. Now, the f2 lens definitely has a couple of things going for it. It's tiny, it's light, it's pocketable, and if you don't mind a little bit slower autofocus, if that's not something you rely on, especially with AFC, and if you don't mind, soft images down to about f5.6 or f8, then this is definitely a good option. And if I were maybe looking for something to just walk around the street with and technical image quality wasn't really something that would influence my decision, I might take a look at this, especially on the second-hand market where you can get one for about half price or even less. So I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments about how you feel about these lenses when it comes to your own photography. Does the extra image quality and autofocus speed actually mean anything to you, or would you prefer to have the smaller, lighter walk-around lens? I'd love to hear how you might use these lenses and which one you think you would prefer for, your type of photography. Now, if you'd like to see a bit of a deeper dive into these two lenses with a lot more sort of side-by-side comparisons of certain scenes, I will have a very, very detailed look at these coming up in the February edition of Fuji Loves Gear Talk. So do head over and check that out. I'll have a link down below. As always, thanks again for watching. I hope that it's been useful for you, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.